Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Our speaker this afternoon is Stuart Squires. Stuart is a theologian. He's a professor at Brescia University. Stuart was born in Maryland. His father was military, so they moved around. But he was educated, his first degree in DePaul University, his MA at the University of Chicago, and his PhD from the Catholic University of America. He has moved from Chicago to Owensboro. Stuart has written many articles, and he's lectured at many conferences across the country. Two things that sort of jumped out at me as I was going through the resume. He was in Peace Corps, the Peace Corps volunteer in Africa for a couple of years. And then another thing that jumped out at me, made me actually stop and do a lot of Googling. He's very computer literate. Programs I never heard of, but as I looked him up, I knew it was a world I knew nothing about also. So he is. Another thing was, we should have had him around at the time we were living St. Augustine's Rule, because he spoke on St. Augustine's Rule. So, you know, who knows what we might hear. Stuart.
Good afternoon, ladies. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to come out today. As a professor at Brescia, of course, Brescia, deep roots with the Ursulines here. Many of you have taught and worked there. And it always feels, I've been to the Mount several times over the past 2 years. This is my third year teaching at Brescia. And it's always wonderful to come to the Mount. The culture and the charism at Brescia, of course, was founded by you all, and I can assure you it's still there and alive today. And coming to the Mount from time to time, it always feels like a homecoming in a sense, because that charism, again, and the culture at Brescia comes from here. So I want to thank you for your invitation, and I'm happy to speak. I'd like to speak for about 45 minutes. I was invited to speak about Catholicism and environmentalism, sort of Catholic way of thinking about environmentalism. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, I'd like to, number one, entertain any questions that you all might have. But then also I'd like to open it up for a conversation. How can we apply these principles, these ideas in our lives, either here at the Mount or in the Diocese of Owensboro in general, or the United States in general. So hopefully we can have a good conversation about that. So I'd like you to be thinking about that question as we have our conversation today. I was speaking to one of my advisees yesterday, and I told her I was coming here, and I told her that I gave you all a handout to read, about 10 pages, and she looked at me shocked and she said, "You gave them homework? What are you doing giving them homework for? You're not supposed to give them homework." I said, "Well, it's only 10 pages. I'm imagining that I was invited here because of Pope Francis's encyclical this summer that I'm sure you've all at least heard about, Laudato Si. I did not assign this because it's well over 100 pages, so I thought 10 pages would be good enough. Although I highly encourage you all to read this if you haven't already. I'm sure some of you have. It's very well written. It's Pope Francis's writing. It's in his style, which is a very conversational style. So it's not dense theology like you might get with Benedict XVI, for example. So at the end, I would like to read a couple of passages from this, which sort of connect with our conversation here in our first document. So that's generally what the structure of what I'd like to do today. If you have your text, go ahead and pull them out. If you didn't have time to read them, that's okay. There are no quizzes this afternoon, so that's okay if you didn't. But I generally don't like to lecture because I don't like hearing myself talk too much. But I think what's more important is digging into the wisdom that the church has to offer to us. And so go through sections of this text read them out loud. Normally I'd invite you all or one of my students in my classes to read out loud, but since I'm the only one with a microphone, I'll just go ahead and do the readings. And then pause from time to time, and I'll sort of give some context or like to underline some important points that this document has for us as to how to think about Catholicism and the environment. This document, you can see on the page 1, was written in 2001, so not that long ago. And it was written, of course, by the United States Conference of the Catholic Bishops, which normally in my classrooms I'd give a short lecture on who they are, but I'm sure you were all well familiar, and I'm sure you all know that the head of that conference is a Kentucky bishop, the Archbishop of Louisville. So global climate change, a plea for dialogue, prudence, and the common good. So let's just start at the beginning, shall we? On the middle of page 1, after where it says introduction. Why don't we start there? As a people of faith, we are convinced that the earth is the Lord's and all it holds. Our Creator has given us the gift of creation. The air we breathe, the water that sustains life, the fruits of the land that nourish us, and the entire web of life, without which human life cannot flourish. All of this is God created and found very good. We believe our response to global climate change should be a sign of our respect for God's creation. I think we should pause there. We could probably spend the entire hour talking about just that paragraph, but just a couple of points to draw out from that section. First of all, we are in a public discourse about environmentalism. And what this document and Catholic environmentalism in general wants to do is not to refute any of the other arguments that have to do with politics or economics or jobs or anything along those lines, but to add a different or new perspective. And that different or new perspective that we generally hear from is a theological perspective. When you watch Fox News or CNN or hear conversations about the environment, which of course you always do, but it will continue to increase in the coming year as the election cycle unfolds. Usually the debates are on economic or political grounds, right? We have to be careful about becoming too environmental because it'll hurt jobs, or then you'll hear the other argument to the exact opposite, that environmentalism is good and it helps create jobs. So economic, political arguments. The Catholic Church, again, doesn't want to disregard any of those, but wants to, as we see here in this first paragraph, offer a new perspective, and that is a theological perspective. That ultimately, why we should be good environmentalists is from a theological perspective, in particular that last line there. Global climate change should be a sign of our respect for God's creation. In my classes, I'm constantly talking about something I'm sure you all know very well, what I like to call the vertical relationship and the horizontal relationship, right? The vertical relationship we have with God and the horizontal relationship we have with our neighbor, right? So how we relate to God is intimately connected with how we relate to neighbor. So think, for example, about the end of the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says, to what you did to the least of my people, you have done it to me, right? The stranger, the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, the poor person, etc. So how we relate to our neighbor is intimately connected to how we relate to God, and vice versa. You can't have a rightly ordered relationship with God and then have a distorted relationship with neighbor, and vice versa. And what this document wants to do, what the bishops want to do, is expand that and not just talk about our neighbor or the individual, but all of God's creation. That we are created in the image and likeness of God, of course, but God is the God and creator of all creation. And so how we treat the world around us, not only our neighbors, but the world itself, is intimately connected to how we relate to God. Again, this is something you never hear about in the public discourses that we have. You're not going to hear Donald Trump say anything about that. You're not going to hear Mike Huckabee talk about that. You're not going to hear Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton talk about that. when they talk about environmentalism. So from a specifically Catholic perspective, right from the beginning, we see that what underlies the Catholic environmental position is the idea of the relationship between God and his creation. And to be good stewards of creation is to be a sign of respect to God. Let's keep going. The continuing debate about how the United States is responding to questions and challenges surrounding global climate change is a test and an opportunity for our nation and the entire Catholic community. As bishops, we are not scientists or public policymakers. We enter this debate not to embrace a particular treaty, nor to urge particular technical solutions, but to call for a different kind of national discussion. Much of the debate on global climate change seems polarized and partisan. Science is too often used as a weapon, not as a source of wisdom. Various interests use the airwaves and political process to minimize or exaggerate the challenges we face. The search for the common good and the voice of poor people and poor countries sometimes are neglected. I think a couple of points to draw out from that. First of all, let's notice how much the bishops want to emphasize science. And this is something I'm constantly talking with my students about. That in our public discourse, it's always, science versus religions, and they're at loggerheads, and that they can't agree with each other. But the Catholic Church, as you all know, is deeply in love with science. And in fact, all of my classes that I teach are in the science building at Brescia. And I don't think that's accidental. And at the same time, we have a crucifix at the front of the classroom that I most often teach in. And I always point that out to my students. I say, I'm sure many of you know, at the top of the building, the science building at Brescia is a, what do you call that? It's a telescope, right? Something like a telescope. In every one of the classrooms is a crucifix. And I say, this is not just a nice piece of art, and because we're Catholic University, we want to put up there. But there's a powerful symbol that's being articulated here by having, on the one hand, a telescope at the top of this building, and at the same time, a crucifix here in the classroom. That we look to the skies, look to the created world around us, to learn all kinds of things, but we always interpret it through a theological lens, through the gospel lens. And so what we see here in this paragraph in particular as an embracing of science and saying, and they even say, we are bishops, we are not scientists or public policy makers. So we want to let the public policy makers and the scientists lead the way here and let them make the specific nitty-gritty decisions on how we do this environmentalism. But as bishops, we want to focus the conversation and put it in the right direction. And it's towards a positive environmentalism because, again, it needs to be a sign of our respect for God's creation. So if you read this document, I'm sure you saw just how often and how much the bishops pointed to science, saying we're not science and we're not going to get into the science here, but let's use science and use it well, not as a weapon. Let's continue on to the third paragraph. At its core, the global climate change is not about economics theory or political platforms, nor is it about partisan advantage or interest group pressures. It is about the future of God's creation and the one human family. It is about protecting both the human environment and the natural environment. It is about our human stewardship of God's creation and our responsibility of those who come after us. With these reflections, we seek to offer a word of caution and a plea for genuine dialogue as the United States and other nations face decisions about how best to respond to the challenges of global climate change. If you have a pen with you, if you don't, that's okay, but I would encourage you to circle that word stewardship in the middle of that paragraph. I'm teaching a moral theology class right now. And in that moral theology class, we're echoing what Aristotle has to say about the virtues. Right? The virtue is the mean between two extremes, right? That middle path between two extremes. And I think this third paragraph here is talking a lot about that idea here. That what's underlying this particular paragraph, and really all of Catholic environmentalism, is the beginning of Genesis, which you all know very well, and that is that we are created in the image and likeness of God, first of all. So that makes us special in some way, sets us apart from the rest of creation. And then God gives Adam the power to name things, to name the animals, which I remember, when I was younger, I thought that was kind of strange and weird, right? That the very first thing that God tells Adam to do is to name things. And then as I got older, it started to make more sense to me. When I would speak to my nieces or my nephew, and they would show me, little kids, and they'd show me their new stuffed doll or their new toy, I found myself asking the question, what did you name your doll? What did you name your new toy? And there's something really theologically profound about God giving Adam the ability to, the power to name things. And that is that it's to say that we are the center of God's creation, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and that we are the center of God's creation. Idea here, we should always be reading, having in the back of our mind when we read this text, the beginning of Genesis. Creation, created in the image and likeness of God, God giving giving Adam the ability, the power to name things. And so the word that has often come, the two words that often come out of that is that we humans have stewardship or dominion over God's creation. Stewardship or dominion. But not domination, right? Not domination. And so getting back to the point I made a minute ago about finding the virtue between two extremes, I think often what we see in environmental conversations these days are two extremes that the Catholic Church wants us to avoid. On the one hand, domination, right? We have dominion and stewardship, but not domination. That oftentimes people look at the world around us and say, well, because we are created in the image and likeness of God, because we have been given the power to name God's creation, therefore the rest of creation is simply an object of use for us. That we can pillage it, that we can mine it, we can do whatever we want with it because it's in service to us, right? So that's one extreme we want to avoid. The other extreme in that environmentalism conversation is the extreme of, think of environmentalists who will chain themselves to the great oak trees and say, if you're and say to loggers, if you want to cut down this tree, you have to kill me to do it. Right? That's what they do when they literally chain themselves to these trees. The problem with that is that does not adequately respect the fact that we are created in the image and likeness of God. That we are, in a sense, different from the rest of God's creation. And so we have two extremes here. Domination of God's creation and a radical equalization of ourselves with God's creation. That we are no different from plants and animals. There are a lot of people who are vegetarians, and there's a lot of good reasons for being vegetarian. But one reason I think we need to be cautious about is the idea of I'm a vegetarian because I don't want to kill God's animals because I am just as equal as they are. Right? So again, we need to find that virtue, that middle path between these two extremes. And I think this third paragraph here is doing an excellent job of pointing that out for us. That we have stewardship over God's creation, but not domination, and at the same time, not thinking that we are that we are exactly the same as the rest of God's creation. Because what happens when we don't take seriously enough the idea that we are created in the image and likeness of God is that and that we are, just as good as chaining ourselves to a tree. That leads to the tragic circumstances of disregarding the human person, right? Which Pope Francis talked about extensively when he was here at the U.S. So, adding a theological dimension to our public discourse, finding the mean between the two extremes here. Let's go ahead and jump to the top of page 2, please. The dialogue and our response to the challenge of climate change must be rooted in the virtue of prudence. Prudence, of course, being one of the 4 cardinal virtues. While some uncertainty remains, most experts agree that something significant is happening to the atmosphere. Human behavior and human activity are, according to most recent findings of international scientific bodies, charged with assessing climate change, contributing to the warming of Earth's climate. Although debate continues about the extent and impact of this warming, it could be quite serious. Consequently, it seems prudent not only to continue to research and monitor this phenomenon, but to take steps now to mitigate possible negative effects in the future. Remember that this document was written in 2011, and Pope Francis's document was written just this past summer. And one thing I think you would notice if you were to compare these two texts together is there is a bit of a caution here in the bishop saying, well, most scientists are pointing to global climate change as a reality. There's no hesitation in Pope Francis. He is calling even more loudly than the bishops here, because we have 15 more years of science underneath our belts. And he's saying it's happening. There's no hesitation here. We need to take this seriously. And this is a great cry for taking this idea of environmentalism seriously. Now, let's pause for a moment and play devil's advocate. Let's say the bishops and Pope Francis are wrong. Let's say those people who disagree, those people who say the environment is not changing, that there is no global climate change. Let's say let's say those people are right. And 50 or 100 years from now, the scientists who say there is global climate change, they're debunked. Well, I don't think that either Pope Francis or the bishops would actually change their tune. Because getting back to our very first point, what's ultimately important for the bishops and Pope Francis is not the economic implications or the environmental implications themselves, but rather the idea that we need to take care of the land because it's a sign of our relationship with God. So even if there is no global climate change, we still need to recycle. Even if there is no global climate change, we need to find other ways than just fossil fuels to power our cars, to power our lights. So even if the science is wrong, and Pope Francis and the bishops are saying it's probably not wrong, Catholic environmentalism wouldn't actually change because it's still rooted in the idea of respect for God's creation. So something significant is happening to the atmosphere, we see the bishops here say. For the sake of time, why don't we jump ahead a little bit. Let's jump to page 3, please. In that third paragraph in the middle, they talk about the virtue of prudence. And again, I think this is something we need to continue to talk about in our public discourse about environmentalism. Usually virtues aren't talked about. It's usually about economic implications, job implications for environmentalism. So we see here, the virtue of prudence is paramount in addressing climate change. This virtue is not only a necessary one for individuals in leading morally good lives, but it is also vital to the moral health of larger community. Prudence is intelligence applied to our actions. Intelligence applied to our actions. It allows us to discern what constitutes the common good in a given situation. Prudence requires a deliberate and reflective process that aids in the shaping of the community's conscience. Prudence not only helps us identify the principles at stake in a given issue, but also moves us to adopt a course of action to protect the common good. Prudence is not, as popularly thought, simply a cautious and safe approach to decisions. Rather, it is a thoughtful, deliberate, and reasoned basis for taking or avoiding action to achieve a moral good. One thing to draw out, I think, from this section is the idea of community and the common good. When I teach, I didn't mention this earlier, but in my online social justice class, this is always the last thing that we talk about. We talk about immigration, we talk about the death penalty, we talk about crime, we talk about economic justice, and then we end up, in my online class, we end up with this unit, because the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops talks about the 7 themes of Catholic social justice. And one of them, the last one, the 7th, has to do with care of God's creation. We see here in this paragraph in particular the idea of the common good and the community's conscience. And I think that's important for us to remember because, again, in our public discourse, what we often see is the idea of the good of the shareholder, right? That we have to be, some people will say, we have to be careful with this environmentalism talk because if the government puts too many regulations or restrictions on my corporation, my company, that's not only going to possibly lead to job loss, but it's going to lead to hurt the stockholder because my shares, the value of my stock might drop. That's certainly a serious consideration, but the Catholic Church here, the bishops are calling for community's conscience and the common good. That although the Catholic Church certainly is not against mitigated capitalism, and that's one of Pope Francis's common themes that he talks about, but the common good needs to be preeminent, needs to, in a sense, trump the idea of the shareholder. Okay? So we see here prudence has to be used. The ability to see the world as it actually is. And what is that? We often, everybody sort of assumes that we see the world as it actually is. But I think there's a reason why prudence is one of the 4 cardinal virtues that we all have to develop a habit of understanding, right? The idea of being able to see the world as it actually is. And what is primary and most important is the community and the common good. Because even though we Americans like to be radical individualists, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but we need to temper that. Again, we need to find that virtue, that middle way between the individual and the community. And we're being called here to always remember that the common good is preeminent. Let's jump to page 4, please. Towards the bottom there, stewardship of God's creation and the right of economic initiative and private property. Freedom and the capacity of moral decision-making are central to what it means to be human. Stewardship, defined in this case as the ability to exercise moral responsibility to care for the environment, requires freedom to act. Significant aspects of this stewardship include the right to private initiative, the ownership of property, and the exercise of responsible freedom in the economic sector. Stewardship requires a careful protection of the environment and calls us to use our intelligence to discover the Earth's productive potential and the many different ways in which human needs can be satisfied. We believe economic freedom, initiative, and creativity are essential to help our nation find effective ways to address climate change. The United States' history of economic, technological innovation, and entrepreneurship invites us to move beyond status quo responses to this challenge. In addition, the right to private property is matched by the responsibility to use what we own to serve, here we see it again, the common good. Our Catholic tradition speaks of a social mortgage on property, and in this context calls us to be good stewards of the earth. It also calls us to use the gifts we have been given to protect human life and dignity, and to exercise our care for God's creation. Another point we see here, responsibility and rights. I think we Americans often we're very good at rights, right? And we lead the way in rights language. Right to life, right to property, right to gun ownership. So we're very good at rights. But the bishops here are also calling us for responsibilities, right? You all know, I say this all the time with my students, and I know I don't need to say this to you, but I'll go ahead and bring it up, that what I love, one of the things I love most about the Catholic Church is it's always a both and. It's a both and tradition. It's never an either or tradition. And we see that here in this particular paragraph, that we are called to, yes, we have rights in particular to private property, rights into economic freedom, initiative and creativity, entrepreneurship. But at the same time, we have the responsibilities. And I think sometimes our public discourse fails in that other half, the other and of the conversation, that we have a responsibility to God's creation, to each other, to the common good. In my moral theology, in my social justice class right now, we read Genesis again, and we saw the conversation about Cain and Abel, where the classic theological question is, am I my brother's keeper? And we see from the beginning of the Catholic Church up until this document and continuing on, the idea that yes, we are in fact our brother's keeper. That we have rights, individual property, right? We're not communists. We do have the right to individual property. At the same time, we have the responsibility of being our brother's keeper. One or two more points from this document. Then I'd like to read a couple of passages from Pope Francis for you that I think connects with what we've been talking about. And then again, I would like to open it up for questions and then a conversation about how we can apply this. So let's go to page 5. Talk about a particular challenge that we see here, and that's the challenge of population, right? This is something we constantly hear about. Population explosion in other countries, and in the developed world, the exact opposite of population stagnation. Same page. So let's read this section on page 5 and see what I'm talking about. Population and authentic development, towards the bottom. Population and climate change should be addressed from a broader perspective of a concern for protecting human life, caring for the environment, and respecting cultural norms and the religious faith and moral values of peoples. Population is not simply about statistics. Behind every demographic number is a precious and irreplaceable human life whose dignity must be respected. In the Catholic Church's teachings, its social teachings, its moral teachings, you constantly trip over this word dignity. The dignity of the human person is constantly at the front of the social and moral and environmental conversation. That when we talk about population, it's not simply about statistics, but for every statistic you have the dignity of the human person resting behind any number. The global climate change debate cannot become just another opportunity for some groups, usually affluent advocates from the developed nations, to blame the problem on population growth in poor countries. Historically, the industrialized countries have emitted more greenhouse gases that warm the climate than have the developing countries. Affluent nations, such as our own, have to acknowledge the impact of voracious consumerism instead of simply calling for population and emissions controls from people in poorer nations. A more responsible approach to population issues is the promotion of authentic development, which represents a balanced view of human progress and includes respect for nature and social well-being. Development policies that seek to reduce poverty with an emphasis on improved education and social conditions for women are far more effective than usual population reduction programs and far more respectful of women's dignity. We should promote a respect for nature that encourages policies fostering natural family planning and the education of women and men rather than coercive measures of population control or government incentives for birth control that violate local cultural and religious norms. What's going on there in those paragraphs? What we see is in secular environmentalism, to deal with the issue of population, because of course the larger the population you have, the more natural resources that need to be used. So a lot of secular environmentalists will say, well, we've got this population explosion, so why don't we just give free birth control to people in developing countries who can't afford birth control, in doing so, that will lessen the population in those developing countries, and in so doing, we'll be using fewer natural resources. We will be not consuming quite as many natural resources, and our, as they say, carbon footprint will be smaller. What you see here is a Catholic critique of that, Catholic environmental critique. The idea that what happens in those perspectives, right? The secular perspective of saying, let's just give them free birth control, is we are placing the environment at the center of God's creation. And what did we see earlier in our talk? That it's not the environment that's at the center of God's creation, it's the human person that's at the center of God's creation. Why? Because we are created in the image and likeness of God. Knowing all the while we need to be good stewards of the land, because it's a sign of our respect for God. But the human person is created in the the image and likeness of God, and therefore that dictates the dignity of the human person. What these secular environmentalists want to do is they want to reverse that understanding. They want to put the environment at the center of God's creation and have the human person be in service to that. And so what they say is, we want to have fewer people so that the environment can flourish. So this Catholic critique here is to say that these secular environmentalists have it backwards. That they're saying that the human person is in service to the environment, and therefore we need to have fewer people, so let's just give away free birth control. Whereas the Catholic Church says, yes, we need to be good stewards of the land, good stewards of the environment, but it's always the human person that's at the center of God's creation, because we are created in the image and likeness of God. And so what I wanted to draw out here in bringing this point up is that, yes, there is a Catholic environmentalism, but it's often at odds with a secular environmentalism. Because here's an example where environmentalists will put the environment at the center of creation and the human person in service to that. My example earlier is an echo of this. The example I used of chaining yourself to one of the redwoods in the redwood forest and say, if you want to chop down this tree, you have to kill me first, right? That's saying that what's more important than the human life, my life, is this redwood tree. The Catholic Church would say, well, okay, sure, we need to protect these trees and protect the environment, but we can always plant new trees. But because the individual human person is unique and can never be replicated, and we are created in the image and likeness of God, therefore we are always at the center of God's creation. So on the one hand, you have the Catholic Church agreeing with secular environmentalists on a lot of things. In particular, there is global climate change, we need to take it seriously. On the other hand, you often see a difference or a tension between Catholic environmentalism and secular environmentalism. And here's just one particular, two examples. This birth control example and the example I gave a minute ago about the redwood forests. So I'd just like to read a couple of quotes to you from Pope Francis this summer. Again, I highly encourage you to pick this up and read it, maybe an Advent reading group or something like that. For the most part, I would say what Pope Francis has to offer here is an expansion on what the bishops have given us. I don't really see anything radically new in what Pope Francis is saying, although he certainly is saying it in his great style that's relatable. So I would encourage you to pick this up and see how many of these themes that we've been talking about today come up again in Pope Francis. Let me just read a couple of them to you. So this is Pope Francis. These problems are closely linked to the throwaway culture. I love that. This is a phrase he uses a lot. I hope you heard him say that when he came to the United States last week. The throwaway culture. Every time I hear that, I think of John Paul II's culture of death, right? I think there's a similarity, a relationship between what Pope Francis is talking about and what John Paul II talked about. These problems are closely linked to a throwaway culture, which affects the excluded just as it quickly reduces things to rubbish. To cite one example, most of the paper we produce is thrown away and not recycled. it is hard for us to accept that the way natural ecosystems work is exemplary. Plants synthesize nutrients, which feed herbivores. These in turn become food for carnivores, which produce significant quantities of organic waste, which give rise to new generations of plants. But our industrial system, at the end of its cycle of production and consumption, has not developed the capacity to absorb and reuse waste and byproducts. We have not yet managed to adopt a circular model of production capable of preserving resources for present and future generations. While limiting as much as possible the use of non-renewable resources, moderating their consumption, maximizing their efficient use, reusing and recycling them. A serious consideration of this issue would be one way of counteracting the throwaway culture, which affects the entire planet, but it must be said that only limited progress has been made in this regard. So we see there this idea of the throwaway culture that if you read the bishop's document, you see hints at that, this idea of we consume, we use, but then we just throw away, right? And in the ecosystems of the world, there are ways of sort of natural recycling, and so we in our industrial society need to find ways of doing that as well. Here's a quote from Pope Francis, getting back to the conversation we had just a moment ago about population growth. To blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues. It is an attempt to legitimize the present model of distribution, where a minority believes that it has the right to consume in a way which can never be universalized, since the planet could not even contain the waste products of such consumption. So you hear Pope Francis echoing the bishops here in this idea of population explosion is not the root problem, nor is fixing that the root solution. Okay? That there are other things that we need to do. In particular, what Pope Francis does here, and as you know, he's great at doing, it's a call to conversion. To call to conversion in our own lives, to think about how we can change the way we live, and not just say, well, let's just give away free birth control to other people and have them reduce their populations. One more quote here for you from Pope Francis. This is a particular thing that I appreciate most about his book. As I said a moment ago, I don't think he really adds anything new to the Catholic environmental position. But one thing that I love that he does in this text is that he makes connections that I don't think the bishops did. In particular, the connections between environmentalism and the rest of the world around us. So for example, he says, you can't be pro-life, right, to be against abortion and not care about the environment. Because at root, what you have is, it's a care for all of God's creation, right? The infants among us and the environment around us. So he says, it's a both and. That you have to be pro-life for people, but you have to be pro-environment. And you have to hold them together at the same time. You can't just be pro-life for people and then ignore the questions of the environment around us. And at the same time, there are many people among us who want to focus only exclusively on environmental questions and not deal with right-to-life issues. And so what he does really well in this document is to locate the question of environment and environmentalism into the larger Catholic thinking about God's creation in general. So here in this quote, I want to read to you, you hear Pope Francis linking this idea of how we think about the environment has to be related to how we think about the right-to-life issues and vice versa. Since everything is interrelated, concern for the protection of nature is also incompatible with the justification of abortion. How can we genuinely teach the importance of concern for other vulnerable beings, however troublesome or inconvenient they may be, if we fail to protect the human embryo, even when its presence is uncomfortable and creates difficulties? If personal and social sensitivity toward the acceptance of the new life is lost, then other forms of acceptance that are valuable for society also wither away. We need to develop a new synthesis capable of overcoming the false arguments of recent centuries. Christianity, infidelity to its own identity, and the rich deposit of truth which it has received from Jesus Christ continues to reflect on these issues in fruitful dialogue with changing historical situations. In doing so, it reveals its eternal newness. God, you just gotta love reading Pope Francis, don't you? So, I'd like to just take a deep breath and take a step back and sort of summarize what it is that we've seen in this document. We've seen first and foremost that the Catholic call for environmentalism is a theological call. It is a call for respect of God's creation, because in respecting God's creation, we are respecting God himself. And that these two are always intimately connected with each other. That we see a call for prudence and common sense. We see a call for the common good. We see that what's the biblical foundations rooted underneath the Catholic understanding of social justice has to do with Genesis, God creating the world. He created it very good. He created us in the image and likeness of God, and he created Adam and Eve and gave them the power to name all the things in the world, which tells us that we have dominion over and stewardship over creation, but not domination, and that we need to find the virtue, the mean between the two extremes of overconsumption on the one hand, domination of the creation as an object of our use for our pleasure, and at the same time, we have to say there is something a bit different about us because we're created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we cannot simply equate ourselves with the environment and therefore put the environment at the center of God's creation and the human person in service to that, which, as we saw, is a difference between Catholic environmentalism and secular environmentalism, where the Catholic Church says, no, we can't just give away free contraception so that we reduce the population problem, because ultimately we have to respect the dignity of the human person. And then finally we see Pope Francis here making connections that we see with the bishops from 15 years ago. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I'm going to open up the floor for any questions that you might have. And then probably the most important thing we're going to do today is I'd like to say, okay, how do we bring this in our lives? How do we, Owensboro in general, or the United States even more general, how do we live out what the bishops and Pope Francis are inviting us to live out? So point one, any questions that you might have of me? I was perfectly that clear? I'm not quite sure about that. Please, sister.
What exactly do you mean between the difference between dominion and domination?
Good question. So, by dominion, what I mean is, again, by God giving Adam and Eve the power to name things, what that's telling us theologically, again, it's kind of weird when you first think about it, but if you stop and think about it, what that's telling us is that because we are created in the image and likeness of God, we are able to plow the land. We are allowed to have private property. We are allowed to be carnivores, right? So that we can kill animals and eat them, that we don't have to be vegetarians. So by dominion or stewardship, think of it sort of a pastoral image, right? The shepherd leads the sheep in a gentle and caring way. So that's sort of what I mean by dominion or stewardship. By domination, which is what we need to avoid, is the idea of exploiting the resources of the planet. So, for example, getting back to the redwood tree example, right? Sure, I got paper here. We need paper, right? Paper is great. So we can cut down trees and turn them into paper and use them. But our responsibility of Dominion and not domination says, well, we need to turn around and replant trees then. Once we've cut them down, we need to replant trees. The problem with this industrial society that we live in is they go into the Amazon, they chop down trees, they turn it into paper, but oftentimes these big industrial companies have no interest in turning around and replanting trees, okay? So that's a difference between dominion and domination, that we can enjoy God's creation, but not exploit it. Does that help answer your question? Other questions that you may have? All right, good. Well, let me ask you all the question then. How do we live this out in our lives, either here at the Mount in Owensboro, the Diocese of Owensboro in general, or the United States of America?
Recycle.
Okay, recycling would certainly. If I had my board, I'd start making a list. But we'll just try to keep this in our memories, right? So recycle would certainly be one. Sister?
There's a board.
Oh, is that a board?
Open it up.
Okay.
Open it.
Okay, shit. Well, now you're gonna have to sit through my horrible handwriting then. Oh, look at that. We got a board.
No, sir.
I'm gonna break that. Be careful. Oop, there's Jesus. Here, I'll do a green marker. Should we do the green for the environment? All right. So we said recycle. Re-C-Y. Did I not do it right? Just do it bigger? Is that what you're asking? Black? Okay, black it is. And I'll write bigger too. Can we be more specific about recycle? I mean, that's certainly true, but re-C-Y-C-L-E. That's certainly true, but can we be a little more specific about what we mean? I mean, how do we do that? It's good to say, I mean, for one thing, does that mean lobby our mayor to get a formal recycling program? What is it? Because then that means you got to pay taxes, right? You got to pay for that. Nobody ever wants to pay more taxes. So what do we mean when we say recycle? What exactly would that entail?
Plastic, paper, anything under the sun that you can recycle.
Okay. Do we want to petition the mayor to start a curbside recycling plan?
If there isn't one, if there isn't one.
Do we have one?
Nope.
Was that shot down? Okay.
Yep.
Probably, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't know. I've only been in Owensboro 2 years, so I certainly am not an expert at Owensboro city politics. I'm guessing it had to do with taxes, right? Nobody wanted to pay more taxes. So that gets back to the rights and responsibilities question. Certainly we have rights, but what are our responsibilities in recycling, and how much easier would it be if we had curbside recycling and you didn't have to take it down to Walmart or something? So recycle. What else can we do in our lives to sort of implement this, what the bishops and Pope Francis are talking about?
Could use less gasoline and less electricity.
Okay.
Use less.
Okay, and this is actually, again, what Pope Francis and the bishops are talking about when they use this sort of theological language of conversion, right? It's a conversion. Metanoia, the Greek word, what's the first thing that Jesus says in the Gospel of Mark is repent, right? The idea of a conversion, of turning yourself around 180 degrees. So using less. Again, I think that's certainly true. We can't disagree with that, but how do we make that a little more practical? How do we make that a little more concrete? Do we have city programs? Do we make charts and lists every day of how much we have used? How do we make this a little more concrete and practical, using less across the board? Gas, less food.
Carpool. Carpool.
Okay, carpool. Other voices?
I think that, I was going to say,
Please.
it's kind of hard for us to use a bicycle to ride into Owensboro, but I know a lot of
Sure.
people will ride their bikes to work rather than drive.
Certainly. I moved here from Chicago, and because it's a big city and people sort of live on top of each other instead of spread out like you do have here in Kentucky, it's easier to bike and walk and take public transportation. So that may be a particular challenge we in the more rural areas have. What else would we want to put on this list? Recycle, use less gas. How can we put into practice what the bishops are calling us to do? How do we use our prudential judgment?
Well, we changed the light bulbs in the chapel to use, do better lights that use less power.
Yeah,
Light bulbs,
and it lasts longer.
okay?
I think we have a lot of ways to recycle. We don't have curbside recycling, but we do have a recycling center in Owensboro.
Okay,
And there are lots of opportunities. We're taking advantage of a lot of them.
sure.
But I think we need to be constantly investigating what is possible, what's out there
Mhm.
for us to use.
So we have a recycling center. I think that last quotation that I read from the bishops also talked about the importance of, bottom of page 5, an emphasis on improved education and social conditions for women. So how do we educate people to go and use maybe the things that we already have? How do we spread the word in the community to say we have this thing? Okay, maybe we don't have curbside recycling, but we have a recycling center. How do we get people to use that? How do we educate so that people will take advantage of this more often?
Well, here I go again, even word of mouth is good. If you say I do this, or if you say I'm going to the grocery, but I'm gonna take my little cloth bag, and I
Sure.
don't want all this paper, I don't want all this plastic. And, a lot of people do that.
Cloth bags. Okay, word of mouth education, certainly important.
Advertisement in the newspaper.
Newspaper. Hopefully we're recycling those newspapers.
We are.
Good,
We we recycle newspaper and magazines.
good, good.
In the Western Plains section of Chicago, they have a certain weekend of the month
Mhm.
to put anything they don't want in their house outside. Anybody can come along and pick it up.
Sure.
And it is really being used. I have relatives living in that area.
How would we summarize that on the board? We could call that dumpster diving. I did a lot of that when I was in college and I was poor. Dumpster diving.
We have that here.
And about once a month, all of the electronics that we don't use anymore,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. Our guys, technicians, whatever they are, they call for us to bring anything at all that we have,
Sure.
so that it can all be taken at the same time and recycled.
Good.
I think to help people to try to not just get what they want, but what they need.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I can go out and buy a lot of things and not even need it.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, I don't have it to throw away.
Mhm. Good. I think what we're seeing here, two themes that are developing are sort of, institutional programs like maybe a curbside recycling, but this idea of using less gas or not buying more than I need is getting back to what the bishops, I think, would really like to focus on, and that is the sort of individual conversion, right? We can, if we really wanted to, we could force the mayor to start a curbside recycling program, and and maybe we would recycle sort of begrudgingly. But I don't think the bishops or Pope Francis want us to do that. They don't want us to simply recycle begrudgingly, but they want us to have a radical conversion, a radical transformation of the heart, so that we, before we even have to recycle, we decide I want to buy fewer things because I don't need these things. And this is certainly a problem that we Americans have, of a question of overconsumption. So I think that's one of the main themes that that we should take away from the bishops is, and they say, we're not scientists, we're not public policymakers, so we don't want to get involved in a question of which programs should we get involved in, which ones should we not. But rather they say we want to talk on a moral and an ethical level, And really what that gets down to is individual conversion of ourselves, so that even if our city decides we don't want curbside recycling because we don't want to pay for the taxes, we as individuals and as a community together, as a Catholic body, we can have this sort of communal conversion experience.
And that's where the conversion came for me, because when I think of global climate change, I'm always thinking politically, economically, and whatever, and very seldom have I taken it to the point of what you took it to, the creation of God's creation and human dignity, and I don't think in those terms.
Sure.
And so it's an eye-opener for me that consumerism and all that, that's the one, aspect, but the
Good, that's great. And I think you're absolutely right. That it's really unfortunate. And again, we're going to see this in our political campaign discourse. When the environment comes up, it's always about jobs, and it's about economics, it's about politics. But I think the Catholic Church has a great voice to add here, and that voice is, it's about a theological perspective, respecting God's creation. It has to do with the human person, ultimately, the dignity of the human person, and it has to do ultimately with individual conversion. That the presidents and the governors and the mayors, they can do their thing, and we like governors and presidents and mayors and all that, but ultimately it comes down to the individual conversion, and that's what Pope Francis, even more so than the bishops, are calling for the individual conversion. And I think that's something that's really great about this document. He does this all the time. He came to the United States and he got in front of our Congress. And, he didn't talk about public policy, but at heart, what was Pope Francis getting at? He was calling the Congress to have an individual conversion, a personal conversion on all kinds of different issues. And that's what Pope Francis does really well in that text. Please.
This is way off the chart.
Okay.
And I don't even know if I can put it in words. But you mentioned the woman who climbed up in the tree.
Sure.
And are you saying you think there's nothing worth dying for?
No, absolutely not. What I think the bishops are saying, though, is, again, we have thinking about virtues, we have to find the mean between the two extremes. And in this particular case, in the environmental case, the extreme that needs to be avoided is to equate humans with trees, humans with the environment, because there is something special about the human person. We are created in the image and likeness of God.
But it's not just the trees that she would be promoting.
Sure.
The trees are necessary for life.
Absolutely.
So, if they're all gone.
Sure, but why can't we certainly have certain areas, right? Maybe the Redwood Forest, where we have that as, and what's great about our country, Teddy Roosevelt, starting a lot of the national parks. Yes, certainly, let's have those select areas where we have national parks, but we can at the same time cut down trees for paper, but not in a domination sort of way, in a dominion sort of way, so that we turn around and we replant. See, the problem with putting your life on the line for a tree is, again, you can plant another tree and it can come up in the same spot. But we as individuals, as human beings, we're unique, we're special, and we can never be replaced. A tree can be replaced, a human person cannot, right? And so that's the tension that we need to walk between the two extremes and finding that virtuous path down between the middle of the two. Does that help answer your question?
It gives a different aspect.
Okay, good.
The umbrella there is shouldering your own responsibilities.
Absolutely, but sometimes we talked about the responsibility language. I'm happy to keep going, but I know we've run out of time. Sister, do we wrap it up? Okay. Again, I want to thank you very much for your time. I encourage you to read, maybe for an Advent reflection, reading Pope Francis's letter together. It's a really wonderful text, and it's perfectly Pope Francis style. So thank you very much for inviting me.